set the tone a little bit for the Cold War, let's just remember that during the 1930s, before World War II, most Americans wanted nothing to do with the rest of the world. Most Americans didn't want to get involved in another war in Europe. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts to try to make sure that America wouldn't be pulled into a war the way it had for the First World War. But Franklin Roosevelt, the president, had a much different idea of what America's responsibilities should be. He certainly wanted to help use America's power to help Great Britain hold off the Nazis. He wanted America to be prepared for the war. That's him signing the draft bill in 1940. And he was already thinking ahead. He wanted America to play an active role in the world after the war was over. And the planning for what the world would look like after Japan and Germany were defeated, much of that planning took place at a conference not that far from here. In July 1944, 44 nations sent representatives to the Mount Washington Hotel up in Bretton Woods. One of the featured speakers at this conference was John Maynard Keynes. That's him there at the lower left. And it was planning for the world economy after the war. And the nations that gathered there at Bretton Woods devised a plan where the U.S. dollar would be the world's primary currency. The system would be that every other currency would have a fixed conversion rate into dollars, and dollars could be exchanged for gold at the rate of $35 per ounce of gold. It makes the dollar the literal gold standard for the world economy. The nations gathered there also created two institutions that would play a role in the economy after the war. The International Monetary Fund, funded with over $7 billion from the United States, was going to help weaker countries pay their bills after the war. The World Bank, also funded with over $7 billion from the United States, was going to make loans to help countries rebuild after the war. You couldn't get a loan unless you balanced your budget and dropped your tariff barriers. So that, for example, to get loans, Great Britain had to open up its empire to American goods. The basic assumption was, for the American planners, that if America dominates the world economy after the war, that will bring peace and prosperity to everybody. What's good for us is good for the whole world. And they had some reason to think that that was true. When the war ended, here are just a few statistics. When the war ended, the United States was the strongest country in the history of the world. In relation to the rest of the world, I mean, look at that. For one thing, it's the only country that has the atomic bomb. But look at the numbers. The United States was producing 2/3 of the oil in the world, had 2/3 of the gold reserves in the world. Manufacturing and electricity were half of what the world produced. And when you look at statistics like that, you might think that nothing was going to challenge the power of the United States going forwards. We were just too big and too darn powerful. But it didn't quite work out that way. In March 1946, Winston Churchill came to make a visit to the United States. He traveled with President Harry Truman to the small college of Westminster College out in Missouri. And Churchill gave a famous speech in which he announced that, and that's the original typed version of the speech as he delivered it, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The communist parties are seeking everywhere to obtain totalitarian control. And Churchill was right. The Soviet army occupied all of Eastern Europe. It had marched through that region to defeat the Nazis, and it hadn't brought its troops home. Between 1946 and 1948, communists took control in alphabetical order of Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. And there was nothing obvious the United States could do about that because those regions were occupied by the Red Army. In 1947, things got a little dicier because the British had been trying to provide financial support for the democratic governments in Greece and Turkey, which, as you can see in the lower right of the map, they're right next to the communist zone. And in both of those countries, the economy was terrible, and the local communist parties were getting stronger and stronger. Britain warned the United States that it couldn't afford to help Greece and Turkey any longer. The State Department warned Truman and congressional leaders that if Greece and Turkey fell to communism, communism would spread all the way to India. This is one of the early manifestations of what became known as the domino theory. Each time a country turns communist, the country next door is in danger, and that can just keep happening, and they can keep falling. So Truman went to Congress, or wanted to ask Congress for $400 million to help Greece and Turkey, which would be about $6 billion today. To get it through Congress, Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who was the leader of the Republicans at the time, he advised Truman to, quote, scare the hell out of the American people. If you want to get that through Congress, you better scare people. So Truman went to Congress and did exactly that. March 1947, he went to Congress, and he delivered a speech in which he laid out that the peoples of the world now have a choice between two ways of living. One way of life is, quote, based on the will of the majority and has free institutions, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The other way of life is based on the will of a minority, forcibly imposed on the majority, and it relies on terror and oppression, a controlled press, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedom. Good versus evil. The world is now divided between good and evil, and Truman's main point was, quote, I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. He has now defined the world as good versus evil, and he has offered American help to any nation struggling to preserve its freedom in the face of communism. We've come a very long way from the isolationism of the 1930s. It's only 1947, but already Truman is basically saying it's our job to protect freedom anywhere in the world. What a huge change in the way people perceived America's role. Now, as it turned out, Greece and Turkey weren't the only weak spots in Europe. Try to imagine what Europe looked like right after the war. I mean, the number of photos like that you could find on the internet, there are many and many of them from all sorts of countries. Houses, farms, and factories had been destroyed. Harvests were very small. People were close to starving. And with all that suffering, the communist parties in Western Europe were getting stronger and stronger. In the first free election in France after the war, the communists got 30%. Looked like maybe they could work their way toward getting a majority. So to try to head that off, the United States adopted another program here in 1947, and it was announced in the curious way of having Secretary of State and former Army Chief of Staff George Marshall give a speech at the Harvard commencement. June 1947. They gave him an honorary degree, and he gave a speech. It's an interesting collection of people in that photo. I don't know if you recognize any of them, but The man on the left is J. Robert Oppenheimer, who also got a degree. And that rather disgruntled-looking fellow on the right is poet T.S. Eliot, who also was being honored and had gone to Harvard many, many moons earlier. So Marshall used his speech to offer American economic help to any country in Europe that wanted it to help rebuild. America had two goals. One was, of course, to try to head off communism in those countries. And the other was, America is not going to be able to sell a whole lot of its stuff to Europe if Europe doesn't get wealthier, if the peoples of Europe don't have enough money to buy our stuff. We had an economic incentive to help Europe rebuild, just as we had a political incentive to help Europe rebuild. Congress approved $13 billion over the next 5 years, which would be about $170 billion today. It's a lot of money. Later that year, Congress, to help us more efficiently fight the Cold War, Congress passed the National Security Act. It merged the Navy Department and the Army Department into the Department of Defense. Up until now, they had been separate. It created a National Security Council to advise the president, and it created the Central Intelligence Agency to gather intelligence and for covert activities. 2 years later, Congress, or I should say the Senate, ratified the NATO treaty. Remember, this is the first peacetime alliance the United States has ever been in. If you can recall, on his way toward retirement, George Washington warned America against being pulled into alliances with other countries. And except for fighting alongside Britain and France in the First World War, without ever calling them allies, because that was a loaded term, America had never had a peacetime treaty until now. And what you now have is a Europe divided into two armed camps. The countries in yellowish on the map, sort of yellow, sort of beige, are neutral. Yugoslavia is interesting. Yugoslavia was communist, but it was ruled by Marshal Tito as an independent communist country. It was not under the thumb of the Soviet Union. And heading into the 1950s, and you folks remember this, I'm sure. The Cold War was portrayed as a struggle between, in kind of apocalyptic terms, a struggle between democracy and totalitarianism, and a struggle between God and atheism. The Reverend Billy Graham, either communism must die or Christianity must die, because it is actually a battle between Christ and the Antichrist. 1954, Congress added "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. One nation under God, to reinforce that we believe in God and the communists don't. In 1949, the U.S. suffered two kind of big psychological shocks. In August, Truman announced that, by the way, the Soviets have actually tested an atomic weapon. And that was years sooner than American scientists thought they could do it. And what it now meant is the Soviets could drop an atomic bomb on Western Europe. There were not missiles yet, but they had bombers. They could at least reach Western Europe. A couple months later, excuse me, the communists led by Mao Zedong, I think I pronounced that right, took power in China. The United States had supplied the government of Chiang Kai-shek with $2 billion of economic and military aid, but it hadn't saved him. Mao took over. The Republicans blamed Democrats and Truman for, quote, losing China. That was a phrase they used over and over again, sort of like China was a phone or a wallet that could fall out of your pocket and you could lose it without realizing it. serious cheap shot, but it worked really well politically. In 1950, Truman approved a program to develop a hydrogen bomb. A number of the atomic scientists, including Einstein, begged the government not to do it because these bombs could kill millions of people at once. But Truman and his advisors assumed correctly that the Soviets were working on one, and they felt they couldn't afford not to develop one for America. The first successful test in 1952 vaporized an island in the Pacific. There it goes on that photo. That bomb was 500 times more powerful than the one that hit Hiroshima. And then in the middle of 1950, the Cold War becomes a hot war in Korea. In June 1950, North Korea, which was communist, invaded the South. They had Stalin's blessing for this. Stalin assumed that the U.S. wouldn't do anything to protect South Korea. The UN Security Council approved the use of force to resist the North Koreans. As it happened, Russia was boycotting the Security Council at the time, so they weren't there to veto what the Security Council voted for. Truman sends in American troops with some help from our allies, drove the North Koreans back up to the border, there in the middle on the peninsula. And once we got back to the border, the question was, do we just keep going and try to unify Korea under a pro-Western government? General Douglas MacArthur assured Truman that no problem, you can go up there, you can conquer North Korea, you don't have to worry about the Red Chinese, they're not going to get involved, and even if they did get involved, they would be easy to defeat. MacArthur was wrong about that. When the U.S. Army did get close to the Yalu River, which was the border between China and Korea, 250,000 Chinese soldiers came charging across the river and pushed the Americans back down the peninsula. Things ended up as sort of a stalemate around the middle of the peninsula. After the 1952 election, Dwight Eisenhower went to Korea, concluded that he could strike a deal that would be basically just a return to the status quo, put the border right back where it was. If Truman had reached that deal, the Republicans would have howled at him for losing Korea and for compromising. But Eisenhower had so much prestige that he could pull off that kind of a settlement, and so the war ended. It's an easy war to forget for a lot of certainly younger Americans, but there were a lot of Americans killed, a lot wounded, and as usual, the local populations suffer more between the Korean armies, the Chinese army, and the poor Korean civilians. Now, how did Eisenhower propose to fight the Cold War? And I don't mean literally fight, but at least how are we going to confront the Soviet Union? Everybody on the American side knew that we would never be able to have an army big enough to match the Russian army man for man. But we had a very good edge in technology. Bombs, planes. So the United States announced a policy, and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles there talking to Eisenhower. And Dulles announced that our policy would be massive retaliation. Another phrase for it was mutual assured destruction, which is conveniently an acronym for MAD. But the idea was, all right, so we don't have as big an army, but any attack by the Soviets on Western Europe or anywhere else that threatens American interests directly, we will respond with atomic weapons. The press started referring to this as the more bang for the buck theory, that we're going to spend our money on bombs and bombers. By 1960, America had two more ways to deliver atomic bombs. Because by that point, you have missiles in silos located in various strategic places in the US. And by the 1960s, you had the Polaris submarine, which could fire an atomic weapon while submerged. So we have 3 delivery systems: bombers, subs, and missiles. In 1950, the United States had 370 atomic warheads. In 1960, we had 40,000. But fighting the Cold War was more than just trying to, have as many bombs and bombers as possible. As Truman put it about Korea, in describing Korea, he said that our homes, our nation, and all the things we believe in are in great danger. And this danger has been created by the Soviet Union. Now, the message there is, what happens on a little peninsula off the side of Asia threatens the survival of America. Okay, if South Korea falls, that somehow is a serious threat to the survival of our country and our way of life, which basically means that events anywhere in the world can threaten the survival of America and require us to get involved. And that was becoming more of a challenge because more parts of the world were in play, you might say, in the 50s and 60s. After World War II, the major European countries simply couldn't afford to maintain their colonies any longer. Britain, gave up, left India. Over the course of the 50s and early 60s, you may remember this, almost every week it seemed like another colony was declaring its independence from some power in Europe. So if you look at that map, all the dark blue and dark red, those are colonies of England and France, and almost all of them become independent during the 50s or early 60s. Now, with so many colonial countries trying to become independent, one question is, well, in the Cold War, which side are they going to be on? Because they have to be on one side or the other, was kind of the American thinking. And a basic limitation on America's ability to understand what was happening is that American leaders just didn't really get how poor many of those countries were and how much a popular movement that wants to, say, redistribute land to the peasants, that kind of a popular movement in many countries in Central and South America and in Asia and in Africa, redistributing land to the poor was a very attractive proposition. But wait a minute, doesn't that sound a bit like communism? American leaders, policymakers, had real trouble not seeing any popular movement like that as affiliated with Soviet communism. And so what do you do? What do you do when some of those countries start implementing policies that threaten property interests? Well, you turn loose the CIA. So we have a few examples. In Iran, in 1951, a coalition led by Mohammad Mossadegh won free elections in Iran, and his government promptly nationalized British oil interests in Iran. Iran was pumping a lot of oil, and most of the money was going to Great Britain, which was controlling the companies at the time. So the CIA helped fund a military coup that threw out Mossadegh and brought back the Shah of Iran. You can see him there looking very military, and you can see him in the lower left sharing a laugh with Eisenhower. The coup destroyed democracy in Iran. For the next 25 years, the Shah ruled the place with an iron fist. In exchange for helping him do that, American oil companies got 40% of the oil business in Iran. So we gained a large segment of Iranian oil production through that. It was not in 2009, President Obama publicly admitted that the CIA had helped to overthrow the democratically elected government in Iran. That's what we did. It took us a long time to admit it, but that's what we did. That was 1953. In 1954, another example closer to home, the CIA helped a military coup in Guatemala. Guatemala, you might not know this, is the world's largest producer of bananas. And in 1954, United Fruit owned half of Guatemala. United Fruit's profits were twice the revenue of the government of Guatemala. In 1950, Jacobo Arbenz and his party won a free election. In 1952, the duly elected government expropriated all uncultivated land for distribution to the peasants. That took away a lot of land from United Fruit, which was not pleased. The CIA trained troops, supplied planes and pilots. The CIA even helpfully drew up a list of people who should be assassinated and provided the Guatemalan military with a manual on different ways to kill people. It worked, of course. The coup worked. Democracy was dead in Guatemala for the next 40 years, really. John Foster Dulles called this the greatest success in the last 5 years against communism. Now, that land reform wasn't communism. It really wasn't, if you know more about what was happening down there. Also in 1954, the United States starts to get actively involved in French Indochina. There's a map of it. After the war, the French tried to regain control over those colonies. As soon as the war ended, Vietnam declared its independence. Its leader was Ho Chi Minh. He was an interesting fella. He had traveled the world in the French merchant marine. He had spent some time in the United States. You may not know this, but Ho Chi Minh was a baker at the Parker House Hotel in Boston for a while in the 1920s. He also went to Moscow and studied, learned a lot there. So after the war, Ho issues a proclamation that quotes the American Declaration of Independence and announces that every people in the world has a right to be free. He sort of thought that the United States, as the author of the Declaration of Independence, would support his efforts to get free from France, but he was wrong. Over the next 5 years, the United States spent almost $3 billion trying to help France hold on to its colonies. In early 1954, the French army managed to get itself surrounded in a very remote region of northern Vietnam at the village of Dien Bien Phu. The French begged us for help. The Joint Chiefs of Staff told Eisenhower we should send in American planes, American troops, and we should use tactical nuclear weapons. Eisenhower said to them, direct quote, "You boys must be crazy. We can't use those awful things against Asians for the second time in 10 years. My God." Eisenhower, being who he was, he could stare down the Joint Chiefs and tell them they were crazy, and they backed off. What did happen in 1954 was a conference in Geneva to decide what to do with Vietnam. The conference divided Vietnam at the halfway point, 17th parallel. The conference scheduled free elections for 1956. The idea would be, in 2 years, all the people of Vietnam will vote on what they want and whether they want to be united under one government or the other. The leader of South Vietnam was a fellow named, and my pronunciation of Vietnamese names is, of course, atrocious, but Ngo Dinh Diem. That's him shaking hands. Well, it's all like, I think that's Eisenhower. He's everywhere. With U.S. support, Diem canceled the elections in 1956 because everybody knew he would lose and that the people of South Vietnam would have voted to join the North. Between 1955 and 1961, we provided Diem with $1.5 billion of economic and military aid. It was the 5th largest amount of any country in the world that in our foreign aid. Considering the place is a really pretty small country, it's kind of remarkable. All right, so that brings us up to the election of 1960 and the victory of John F. Kennedy. And I want to show you the famous clip from his inaugural speech because this is the Cold War view of the world in a nutshell.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Okay. We will do anything. We will pay any price. We will bear any burden anywhere in the world to protect liberty. That's a pretty broad mission statement. That's the Cold War talking. Now, almost immediately, Kennedy stumbled into a public relations disaster involving Cuba. During the 50s, the U.S. supported a military dictator in Cuba named Batista. This is classic economic imperialism. The United States controlled 25% of the banks, 40% of the sugar production, and 90% of the mining on Cuba. And so we spent a lot of money to help Batista stay in power. But in 1959, Castro's rebels overthrew the Batista regime. Castro promptly nationalized $1 billion of American property and started accepting economic military aid from the Soviet Union. So the CIA, they have a solution. They come to Eisenhower with a plan to train anti-Castro Cubans who will invade Cuba and liberate the Cubans from Castro. Kennedy inherits this plan, and Kennedy's advisors tell him, don't worry. When the invasion force lands, the Cuban people will rally to the cause and will help to overthrow Castro. Well, no. Cuban troops immediately surrounded the folks when they landed on a beach. The Cuban people had no interest in abandoning Castro at that time. It was a complete public relations disaster. One of Kennedy's responses was a public relations coup, which was to create the Peace Corps. And you could say the Peace Corps is the idealistic side of the Cold War. The notion that we are so wealthy, we can share our wealth and share our talented young people with impoverished countries around the world. The next crisis is in 1962 is the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. You all probably remember something about where you were while this was happening. In October 1962, spy planes revealed missile sites being constructed on Cuba. I don't pretend to know what those photos show, but if you're skilled in the craft, you can tell that that is Those are missile launchers and missile silos under construction. The Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to invade Cuba, which, since there were plenty of Soviet military personnel on Cuba, could have led to some serious consequences. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara came up with a proposal for a naval blockade to just prevent anything additional from getting to Cuba. So John Kennedy went on TV to announce a quarantine. Here's a clip from that speech.
I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Okay, so you got that, right? A missile-happy Cuban or Soviet officer could have pushed a button and started World War III, because Kennedy had promised any missile launched from Cuba aimed anywhere in the hemisphere would be treated as an attack by the Soviet Union, warranting full retaliatory response, which was a lot of atomic bombs at that point. Now, luckily for all of us, Kennedy's strategy worked. The Soviet ships turned around. We reached a deal with the Soviets. They promised to remove the missiles from Cuba. We promised not to invade Cuba. And secretly, we also promised to remove some elderly atomic missiles from Turkey. I mean, remember, there is kind of a double standard. We can have atomic missiles in Turkey, which is right next door to the Soviet Union, but if they put some in Cuba, which is right next door to us, that is unacceptable. Now, we were strong enough that we could get away with that, but there's a certain hypocrisy involved, I think you could say. Shortly after the crisis, the two governments constructed the hotline to try to improve communications between the White House and the Kremlin. And this brings us up to the Vietnam War. Vietnam really only mattered because of the Cold War. It doesn't have many natural resources. Vietnam is mainly a good place to grow rice, and it was a country of peasants who were doing their best to stay alive growing rice. But because of the Cold War, it becomes vitally important. And the United States was determined to help Diem avoid being taken over by the local communists. So we sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese army. Our advisors went into combat with them, showed them how to use American helicopters and other American weapons. You can see those very helpful Americans showing South Vietnamese people how to aim their rifles and stuff. The number of advisors kept growing. By the time John Kennedy was assassinated, there were 17,000 advisors in Vietnam. And several of them had already been killed on military missions with the South Vietnamese. One problem was that Diem's government was extremely corrupt, and eventually things got so bad that the State Department signaled that we wouldn't really mind if there was a military coup in Vietnam. And the military overthrew Diem just a few weeks before Kennedy was assassinated. It didn't bring stability to Vietnam. We just had a whole series of military regimes. The big turning point happens in August 1964. Lyndon Johnson is now president. And as part of our advice, the U.S. Navy is helping South Vietnamese commandos attack installations on the coast of North Vietnam. Like, we're ferrying them over there and supervising things, and then when they're done, we bring them back. That's part of our advice. In August 1964, a North Vietnamese patrol boat fired on the USS destroyer Maddox. When Defense Secretary McNamara briefed reporters, he lied about where the Maddox was and what it had been doing. And it's a little hard to tell, but McNamara's map of where the Maddox was is much closer to South Vietnam and away from the coast compared to that map at the top, which shows where it really was. McNamara said, how he had the nerve to do this. Our Navy played no part in, was not associated with, was not aware of any South Vietnamese actions, even if there were any. Like, we don't know what they were doing, but even if they were doing something, we weren't part of it. It was a bold-faced lie. Lyndon Johnson took the opportunity to ask Congress for a blank check, and the Tonkin Gulf Resolution authorized him to take all necessary measures to prevent further aggression. And that really was a blank check. He could do pretty much anything he wanted at that point. Johnson tried to downplay Vietnam during the campaign against Barry Goldwater. He actually said, "We don't want our American boys to do the fighting for Asian boys. We don't want to get tied down in a land war in Asia." While he said that, the U.S. military was already planning for bombing campaigns and the use of ground troops in Vietnam. In February 1965, the Vietnamese attacked a U.S. air base. Johnson responded by ordering a bombing campaign that basically lasted until the 1968 election. He also sent Marines to guard American air bases, which was the first use of combat troops on the ground in Vietnam. And then later in 1965, let's try that a little harder. There we are. Johnson made the fatal decision to escalate. General William Westmoreland there said, if you give me 175,000 men, I can take care of the Viet Cong and the threat to South Vietnam. Just 175,000, please. Defense Secretary McNamara there advised Johnson to give the Army what they asked for. And the goal was to buy time until South Vietnam could defend itself. Johnson told a reporter, "I don't believe I can walk out. If I walked out, they'd take Thailand. They'd take Cambodia. They'd take Burma. They'd take Indonesia. They'd take India. They'd come right back and take the Philippines. I'd be another Neville Chamberlain, and we'd have another Munich." Okay, so it's 20 years later, 25 years later, but American leaders are very much prisoners of what happened leading up to World War II when people didn't stand up to Hitler, and they feel like you have to stand up to communism wherever it is, which wasn't crazy thinking. Unfortunately, with hindsight, it turns out to have been a huge mistake, and it didn't work. But you could kind of understand how they got to that place. Johnson kept sending men, kept dropping bombs. By 1968, we had 500,000 soldiers there. During the campaign, Nixon told a speechwriter, "I've come to a conclusion that I wish I could do a Nixon imitation. There was a day when I was actually pretty good at one. All of my friends were good at them too." Anyway, Nixon told a speechwriter, "I've come to the conclusion that there's no way to win the war. But we can't say that, of course. In fact, we have to seem to say the exact opposite." So Nixon promised that he had a secret strategy. After he was elected, he unveiled that strategy, which was basically to wind down the use of ground troops, to increase the use of American bombers, and to try to pound the North Vietnamese to the peace table. And if necessary, he sent troops into Cambodia and Laos to try to catch the communists on their way down into South Vietnam. He lied about what he was doing, but it worked. Troop levels came down, the deaths came down, the anti-war movement fizzled out, because things seemed to be getting better. And then finally, in 1973, his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, worked out a deal with North Vietnam. All of our troops come out in 60 days. North Vietnam releases our prisoners of war, and the people of South Vietnam get to decide their own fate, which sort of sounds okay, except the ceasefire said nothing about the 200,000 communist troops sitting in South Vietnam. They didn't have to leave. And so it really was only a matter of time before they were able to overthrow the government of South Vietnam, which finally happened in 1975. Again, casualties, this is even worse than Korea for the Americans, and once again, the opposing army and the civilians suffer the most. Now, Nixon, I can remain objective when I say that Richard Nixon was a crook who resigned in disgrace, but I also have to say objectively that he deserves a lot of credit for trying to reduce the tensions in the Cold War. In February 1972, he surprised almost everybody by visiting China. The arch enemy, the yellow peril, the things that he said about Red China back in the late 40s, early 50s, and yet there he is shaking hands with Mao and Zhou Enlai. He promised rather vaguely that someday we would normalize diplomatic relations with China. The goal was to drive a wedge between communist China and communist Russia by working our way in so that we can play them off against each other. A few months later, he completed the circuit. He went to Moscow and visited Leonid Brezhnev, and they signed a treaty that froze a certain kind of missiles for the next 5 years. For a few years, Nixon and Gerald Ford pursued a policy they called détente, which involved softening of relations. The Soviets had a lot of trouble growing enough grain. Year after year, their production came up short, so America started helping out. In 1973, we sold 1/4 of American wheat production. We sold it to the Soviet Union. American farmers were delighted. Another sort of smaller but symbolic event was a joint space mission in 1975. But the U.S. was also continuing to fight the Cold War the old-fashioned way with the CIA. It's military coup time again. 1973, Chile has a duly elected government where the president just happens to be a Marxist, Salvador Allende. The CIA helped the Chilean military overthrow Allende. General Pinochet took command. There he is shaking hands with Kissinger there. Pinochet ruled until 1990, and his regime tortured and murdered thousands and thousands of Chilean residents. It was one of the most notorious governments in the 70s and 80s. Détente didn't really last all that long. By the late 70s, the Soviets seemed to be causing trouble in the Mideast, where they support the PLO. They're supporting Marxist governments in Cuba and Vietnam. They're supporting left-wing guerrilla movements in Central America. The relations are souring, and then détente really died at the end of 1979 when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Their goal was to protect a pro-Soviet government from the Islamic militants who wanted to overthrow it. This is Vietnam for them. This is protecting a client state against a popular movement that wants to overthrow the government. And the Soviets pumped thousands and thousands of troops. The United States decided to help out. We provided $3 billion of economic and military aid to the radical Islamists in Afghanistan. The Cold War ends, and that's during the 70s I'm talking about, and the 80s. The Cold War really enters its final phase after Reagan wins. In 1980, as we all know, Reagan was deeply anti-communist. He gave a speech at the National Association of Evangelicals in 1983 in which he referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Reagan really believed that America had a special mission in the world. Quote, "We did not seek world leadership. It was thrust upon us. It has been our destiny almost from the first moment this land was settled. I believe God had a divine purpose in placing this land between the two great oceans to be found by those who had a special love of freedom." Now, Reagan was not referring to the Indian tribes who actually did find this continent and who had a very special love of their freedom. He is talking about manifest destiny for European settlers. And he really believed America had a mission. And he backed up his rhetoric with a lot of defense spending. And one of the cornerstones was the Strategic Defense Initiative, a system of ground and space-based systems to shoot down enemy missiles. Everyone called it Star Wars. You got to love the political cartoon there. That's Reagan explaining that he's been getting some help from a crack team of experts, and the experts seem to include R2-D2 and C-3PO from Star Wars and E.T. Reagan didn't just spend money on the military. Reagan also sent in the Marines. So the island of Grenada, you might almost be able to see it there on that map. It's a tiny speck in the Caribbean. There were 89,000 people living on Grenada, which is exactly the size of Newton, Massachusetts. Okay, so this was not like a large island with a lot of people. But in 1982, a Marxist regime took power on Grenada with some assistance from the Cubans. And in 1983, there were about 800 Cubans working on the island, expanding the airport, building a longer runway. Reagan announced that the Cubans on Grenada were a threat to the survival of the free world. He sent in 7,000 Marines to rescue Grenada. The justification was that there were 700 Americans on the island. 600 of them were going to one of those Caribbean medical schools, and he needed to save them because they were in danger. The night they were liberated, a group of the American medical students told Ted Koppel on Nightline that they weren't in any danger at all. They were fine. Somebody got to them because by the next day they were talking about how scared they were and how grateful they were that the Marines had arrived. So they changed their tune, but there was no threat. The UN General Assembly voted 108-9 that this invasion was a flagrant violation of international law. Reagan didn't care. And he announced, you gotta love this, "Our days of weakness are over. We've kicked Vietnam syndrome." Quote, "Our military forces are back on their feet and standing tall." 7,000 Marines overcoming 600 Cuban construction workers? All right, anyway, the press loved it. We had licked the fallout from Vietnam finally. Now, just when it looked like the Cold War was going to continue to get worse, Mikhail Gorbachev shows up in the Soviet Union. He takes power in 1985. Very smart guy, trying to figure out how to save the Soviet system. And he realized that the USSR could not possibly compete with the United States in the arms race. At that time, we were spending $34 million every hour on defense. The Soviets couldn't come close. And he couldn't afford to keep supporting the army in Afghanistan. He couldn't afford to keep supporting Marxist governments in other parts of the world. And at the same time, Gorbachev thought he could strengthen the communist system by lifting some of the censorship, releasing the last of the political prisoners, and making some room for individual choice in the economy. He announced that the USSR was going to stop nuclear testing of any kind. And it was that opening that led to, during Reagan's second term, a series of summits between Reagan and Gorbachev. These are really fun if you actually read about the details, because the two guys liked each other, and Reagan was truly terrified of nuclear war. He absolutely didn't want to see anything like that happen to America. And Reagan, unlike his advisors, realized that Gorbachev was different. And Reagan, to his credit, was flexible enough to see an opportunity to soften the Cold War. His advisors were terrified. They didn't believe anything Gorbachev said. But in walking around at these summits, Reagan and Gorbachev practically agreed to get rid of all nuclear weapons. They came this close, and their advisors, eventually stepped in and prevented that from happening. But Reagan gets a lot of credit, to me, a lot of credit for genuinely looking for a way to deal with Gorbachev that most Republicans didn't see it at all. In 1987, Reagan goes to Berlin.
If you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
One of his greatest hits. A few months later, Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to remove most of their intermediate-range atomic missiles from Europe. It was the first treaty that ever provided that each side would destroy some of its existing weapons. That's a big deal. In May 1988, Reagan visited Moscow, and somebody asked him, do you still think the USSR is an evil empire? And Reagan said, no, you are talking about another time and another era. In late 1988, Gorbachev goes to the UN and essentially announces that the Soviet Union is giving up on the Cold War. He told the General Assembly, it is obvious that the use or threat of force can no longer be an instrument of foreign policy. This applies to nuclear arms, but that's not all. Freedom of choice is a universal principle that should allow for no exceptions. Now, that was a signal that the Red Army wasn't going to step in if things started changing in Eastern Europe. During 1989, things did change in Eastern Europe. In August, Poland had free elections, and the Solidarity movement won 160 out of 161 seats. Lech Walesa. Gorbachev, about those election results, Gorbachev told the Council of Europe, this is exclusively a matter for the people themselves to decide. Any interference in internal affairs, even with our friends and allies, is impermissible. And one after another, the other Eastern European countries overthrew their communist rulers and started setting up systems with elections. Those are crowds in some of the other European capitals. And then on November 9th, 1989, the government of East Germany announced that they were going to relax the travel restrictions on going to West Germany. That opened up the possibility of West Germans and East German families being reunited for the first time since the World War II. So that night, this is November 9th, 1989, that night a lot of young East Berliners decided it was time to visit West Berlin right now. And thousands of them showed up at the gates wanting to go through. And the poor young Soviet soldiers there, the guys are guarding the gates, and there's this huge crowd of people who want to go through. And they did the smart thing. They opened the gates. And the East Berliners went prancing into West Berlin. People said all kinds of nice things to each other. And people started climbing on the wall, and by the next day, people started hacking at the wall to tear it down. I had a son who was 2 weeks old at this time, and I remember sitting there. I got him, I've got a bottle, and I've got a TV, and I am watching people dancing on the top of the Berlin Wall, thinking, how is this possible? Who ever thought you'd see that? Now, what turned out is that Gorbachev was well-meaning, but underestimated the threat that he was creating for the Soviet system. Once you started opening up the economy and opening up the press in Russia, he couldn't control what happened. And there was more and more public criticism of the government, more and more proposals for more and more capitalism within the Russian economy. And so in the middle of 1991, top communist leaders and top Soviet military generals decided they had to overthrow him. They confined him to a lodge. He was vacationing at the Black Sea. They locked him up in his lodge there. They sent tanks into Moscow to try to restore order. Boris Yeltsin, remember Boris Yeltsin? At the time, Yeltsin was the president of the Russian Republic. It would be sort of like being governor of Massachusetts, or, considering how big Russia is, more like governor of California, the biggest state in the Russian Union. Yeltsin urges the people of Moscow to resist. He goes out of the city hall, and ends up getting on top of a tank, urging the Soviet soldiers to not fire. He's pleading with them, and it's like an anti-war protest in Vietnam. Look at that. People are putting roses into the turrets of the tanks in the upper left there. Vast amount of people in the streets, and the Soviet army doesn't shoot. I think there were a couple of places where they opened fire, but very briefly. It was basically a peaceful event, and the coup failed. Gorbachev returned from the Black Sea, but it was pretty clear that Yeltsin was now in charge. And the USSR disintegrated really quickly over the next few months. Each individual republic declared its independence. On Christmas Day, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. The hammer and sickle flag came down. The red, white, and blue flag of the old Russian czars went back up. And I love that headline from the Greenville News. Gorbachev quits as president of country that no longer exists. Early 1992, President George H.W. Bush and Yeltsin toast the end of the Cold War. And I should point out, for a brief shining moment, it looked like Russia might be heading in the direction of liberalization and more capitalism, free elections. Yeltsin looked like a promising hope for the future for a short period of time there. Okay, so I need to wrap this up. Who says there aren't any happy endings in my lectures? Right? I mean, everybody agrees that the United States won the Cold War. Now, what can we learn from that? And I just want to toss out a few lessons. First, I think it's fair to say that the U.S. military didn't really win the Cold War. I mean, the U.S. military found itself in a stalemate in Korea and found itself in a disaster in Vietnam, particularly in Vietnam, trying to fight a war that they were not prepared for against an enemy they'd never encountered before. The military didn't really make it happen. I mean, yes, we did conquer Grenada, but I'm not prepared to chalk that up as a big win. Excuse me. I think it would be more accurate to say that the American economy won the Cold War. Right? I mean, this is sort of like, it's a bit like World War II. Yes, the American Army did a heroic job in World War II, but it was the American economy that turned out so many planes and tanks and ships and munitions that just overwhelmed the Germans and the Japanese. And without actually shooting them, all those planes and tanks and weapons overwhelmed the Soviet economy too. The Soviets simply could not match our ability to produce all that weaponry and still have a good, comfortable standard of living for most Americans. That was a combination the Soviets couldn't do. All right, now, the Cold War was pitched, and I'm sorry I'm running late, but what are you going to do? The Cold War was pitched in America as democracy versus totalitarianism. We called ourselves the leader of the free world. But on some level, that's a myth. If you look at how the United States actually fought the Cold War, we weren't necessarily always the leader of the free world. I mean, we spent billions to try to help France hold on to colonies when the people who lived in those colonies wanted to be independent. We gave billions of dollars of military aid and economic aid to dictators all over the globe. Egypt, Turkey, Pakistan, Chile, El Salvador, Guatemala, Peru, the Philippines. Remember Ferdinand Marcos? He didn't exactly have a democratic government there. Indonesia. On a very fundamental level, what mattered more to American leaders was whether a country was opposed to the Soviet Union, not whether the country offered political freedom to its own citizens. And when a popular movement threatened property interests, Iran, Guatemala, Chile, what did we do? The CIA helped overthrow a popularly elected government in the interests of protecting property rights. There's, not to be too cynical, but on one level, the Cold War was about protecting international capitalism from the threat of communism, not protecting democracy and self-rule for the peoples of the world. All right, so end this up. We did win the Cold War, though. When the Soviet Union imploded in 1991, the U.S. was, once again, we were the most powerful country on the planet. And many Americans in 1991 thought that meant the United States could do whatever it wanted and accomplish whatever it set out to do in the world. And as we're going to find out next week, it didn't really work out that way. Anyway, that's enough for me. So again, next week it's Wednesday, not Thursday. Thank you all for being here on such a lovely rainy day.